So I found Oliver's book literally a very refreshing antidote to all the rather hollow and short-lived promises of the happiness industry. In fact, I'm going to come out and say it absolutely boldly. I love this book. I really love this book. I love its mixture of personal anecdote combined with rigorous scientific research. And I love the fact that when you look in the index, you'll find references that cover everything from the Mahabharata, which we saw so unforgettably here in Adelaide a few years ago in the Peter Brook production, to The Matrix. So, Oliver, you cover some really remarkable ground. And what I'm hoping that we're going to do in the course of this hour is explore many of the different ideas in the book and around the book, because obviously the book raises a lot of tangential questions that you haven't been able to cover. I wanted to start by asking you for a little bit of context in a way. I wonder when you think that happiness as a concept gained commercial traction and what brought that about. Was that a sort of post-war phenomenon?
I think it's largely a very recent phenomenon, certainly over the last century. Obviously, the interest in answering the question of what happiness is goes back to the earliest philosophy. But you certainly get various changes happening in American Christianity. You get the Depression. I think there's a big market in the aftermath of that for the message that you don't need to be the victim of social structures and economic forces, that you can think your own way to success and to happiness. And then it just really seems to keep going and not stop. I'm sure it's got a lot to do with increasing individualism, decline of religion, and other forms of, other focuses for people to get that kind of advice.
And do you think at the root of all of this sort of interest is our expectations, and whether our expectations, say, compared with the expectations of previous generations, are unreasonable when it comes to happiness, that we've been sort of led to believe that we're entitled to happiness in terms of, even the wording, the pursuit of happiness being enshrined in a really important document as far as one nation's identity. Do you think our expectations are basically wrong?
I think they probably are. I think they're certainly unclear. I've heard it persuasively argued that the reason Denmark does so well in international surveys of well-being is because they, on balance, don't expect that much out of life, and therefore their expectations are amply met. The American Constitution case is a really interesting one because it's something there not just about what you have a right to expect, but this idea that you should dedicate yourself to constantly seeking for more. Yes. So wherever you set the sort of the goal point, that it gets further and further away because the job is to always be seeking more of it and better. And it's such a strange, mysterious term, happiness. We could talk about that alone. I don't suggest we do, but we could talk about that alone for this whole hour. And yet, in the self-help industry, and especially in this field of positive thinking that I particularly sort of have in my sights here, it mainly just seems to mean feeling excited all the time. A very, very different conception of happiness to ancient philosophers and various spiritual traditions. And that's just really tiring and stressful.
It is.
It's not actually a very happy way to be, constantly on the lookout for any sign of not being excited.
So you've mentioned Denmark, and we're talking about the American Constitution. What do you make then of Bhutan's approach to the alternative to measuring gross national productivity as in gross national happiness?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I'm not an expert on the Bhutan case, but this came up again when David Cameron in the UK started to announce the happiness index, the same thing, measuring national performance by well-being indicators. And of course, the first response, which I have a lot of time for, is it's just some attempt to distract attention from the sort of underperforming economy, and in the Bhutan case, as I understand it, a relative lack of democracy. And so there's all these kind of reasons there's all these kinds of ways in which setting happiness as your national goal is incredibly exploitable by people who just want you not to think about how bad the economy is. But then it gets you very swiftly into some really weird questions, like if you could make everybody in a country really happy, maybe it wouldn't matter that they were not doing so well economically if they actually genuinely were happy about it. I definitely think there's lots to be said for seeking to measure a nation's success in ways other than just a single indicator of economic growth. But those well-being indicators are they're pretty much in their infancy. Actually successfully measuring a country's happiness is a very challenging task. Maybe you can't do it at all. I don't know.
I suppose the flip side of that is the fact that, according to the World Health Organization, we are in the middle of an increasing epidemic of depression, which is sweeping through the Western and developed world. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly very clear whenever you look at these international comparisons for what they're worth, and you look at the health of the self-help industry in different countries, there's no correlation between where is happiest and where the places that seem to seek out advice on being happy. You might say that's obvious because clearly self-help is a response to a felt need. Then again, you could say, well, if it was any good, those people would have read it and it would have worked. There are certain problems as well to do with the sort of medicalization of ordinary sadness that I think is quite a big topic of debate at the moment, whether that's always a wise approach. But I just think the main thing I discovered in the course of researching and reporting this book is that that whether you are depressed or not, whether depression is prevalent in the place that you live or not, the conventional approaches we have to feeling happy are not a good way to address it. And I think that's positive thinking is extremely, almost perfectly wrongly suited to trying to find a path through depression.
I think that phrase you just used, the medicalization of ordinary sadness, is a really poetic phrase.
I don't think it's mine, actually.
But
anyway.
Would you like to introduce us to some of the most interesting people in your book early on are people who are living a contemporary interpretation of Stoicism. Could you talk a little bit about that and about the Stoics in antiquity in the classic term and how that is lived today?
Certainly. I mean, I blatantly and explicitly just plundered bits from any philosophy that I thought would be helpful for my purposes in this book. So I don't pretend to present Stoicism in every detail. But the key thing about Stoicism, very different, by the way, from how the word is used these days, especially in Britain, to mean sort of pretending that everything's fine and stuffing your emotions down and putting a brave face on it. The Stoics, the original Stoics in ancient Greece and Rome, had a much more accommodating attitude towards negativity, which is really my main point throughout this book, that we need to try to cultivate that. There's a technique that I write about a lot, which I thought was wonderful, that they called the premeditation of evils, also known as negative visualization. The idea that sometimes it's actually best to not to try to persuade yourself that everything's going to go well, but to dwell in some detail on how badly things could go, because then you will be prepared. You will, to some extent, sap the poison of anxiety about the future by thinking through exactly how badly things could go, because most of the time, in most contexts, the answer is not as badly as you were thinking. And then also Seneca adds, it's a great way to feel grateful and appreciative for the things you have, is to go around reminding yourself that you could lose them all, that you will lose them all, I suppose, in an ultimate sense. And this whole Stoic idea goes back to this fundamental insight that it's not events in the world that cause our distress, but the beliefs that we hold about events in the world. The strange thing about that insight, which I think is clearly and obviously true, is that in the hands of various nightmarish positive thinking people that I encountered, that gets turned into the argument that you should therefore try and make all your beliefs about the world as positive as possible. And we can talk, if you want, a bit about why that never works. The Stoics seem to just say, just that recognition that that's where distress comes from, just the realization that it's your beliefs that are upsetting you, is an incredibly empowering one. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to never be upset about anything, or that it's wrong to feel upset about anything. Although the sort of hypothetical Stoic sage, the perfect Stoic, I think is a bit of an inaccessible character, sort of not bothered by even the deaths of people very close to him or her. But that basic idea, that sort of reminder that this is how sadness and anxiety get created, is a very useful one, I think.
So would that be akin then to the kind of non-attachment that Buddhists develop through meditation, which you do also address in another wonderful chapter? But I mean, are there links, are there similarities there?
Yeah, there's definitely overlaps and sort of confluences. I think that they are not the same thing, partly because at least Roman Stoicism, the later Stoicism, does seem to be targeted at the idea that you should achieve contentment, that there is a kind of inner state that you're striving to achieve. And a big part of the Buddhist idea is that although that might be the end point of the Buddhist path, you shouldn't be trying to strive to achieve anything. You should be letting whatever emerges in your interior life arise and pass away, and scrutinize it in some forms of meditation, but not sort of try to cling on to the good feelings and emotions and push away the bad ones, which is, again, the basic idea of what you should do in modern American self-help. So yeah, I tried that on a week's meditation retreat. It was kind of pretty arduous. Yes.
Well, we might come to that. But one of the things that I love so much about this book is that every theory that Oliver writes about, he tests out on himself. So in relation to Stoicism, would you like to tell us a little bit about shame-attacking exercises on the London Underground?
Oh, all right then. I went to interview for this book a psychotherapist who has since died, called Albert Ellis, who was very famous and wrote books with titles like How to Stubbornly Refuse to Upset Yourself About Anything, yes, anything, ! He was great. And he was very influenced by Stoicism, and one of his ideas was that you should, if you were very concerned about what other people thought of you, very afraid of embarrassment and of sort of humiliating yourself and all these things, which he encountered a lot in his clients, that you should undertake what he called a shame-attacking exercise. He suggested you should do it on the New York City subway, because that's where he was based. I ended up doing it on the tube. The idea is that you bring your fears about embarrassment into direct encounter with the reality of embarrassing yourself. So in this case, what you're supposed to do is travel on the Underground train and just speak out loud the name of each station as you approach it, so that everybody can hear. And the really strange thing about this is that, clearly I can tell from a bit of your reaction that, like me, you thought that's a horrifying thought in some respects. But it's really strange that it should be so horrifying, because when you think about it in detail, you're not proposing to sort of verbally abuse anyone or harass anyone or cause a fight. Arguably you're helping them, right? Because you're telling them the name of the next station. So that it seems like the beliefs that one holds about that are out of proportion to the reality. And very simply, the act of doing it is just to sort of force an encounter between those two things, and thereby cut the beliefs down to size. I did it on the Central Line. It wasn't fun. Don't get me wrong, but it wasn't the kind of horrifying that the anxiety would suggest. So what happens? A couple of people look up from their newspaper, like you might be a little bit crazy, and then they go back to looking at their newspaper, because, as social psychology has found again and again, most people most of the time are thinking about themselves and not about you, so you don't need to be so self-conscious.
Is it a kind of technique that in order to maintain your Stoic fitness you have to top up? So would you have to every 3 months undertake this exercise again?
Possibly, and I haven't. I mean, for a few hours afterwards, it made me feel, I felt absolutely great. I can't tell you, it's really weird, but there you go. But then it faded, and I do still think about it and sort of think, well, if I can do that, then. But I have to say I haven't repeated it.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you felt great for a few hours afterwards, because that relates to the thing called the hedonic treadmill, doesn't it? That basically the research in positive psychology shows that that we feel good with certain things in our life, beauty, fame, wealth being the three kind of obvious ones, for very short periods of time only, that this is a very fleeting kind of happiness. Could you just say a little bit about the sort of hedonic treadmill?
Yeah, and I fear actually that it applies even beyond those fairly superficial things, and even applies to, profound relationships and fulfilling work and all these things. We're so adaptable. We're so very, very designed to acclimatize and to incorporate whatever we have into the functioning of our lives, that so the obvious cliched example, a new car, it's really fun and gives you a lot of pleasure for a few days, but then it becomes the background condition for your life, and so it ceases to deliver pleasure. The most famous studies in this regard have shown, to paraphrase a little bit, that both people who win the lottery and people who undergo accidents that leave them paraplegic are within a year or two, I forget the exact timescale, back to their pre-existing set point of happiness. If they were grumpy people before they won the lottery, they're grumpy people again. Yeah. And if they were happy, calm and relaxed people before they became paraplegic, they're basically happy and relaxed thereafter. In the case of when something very bad happens to you, that's clearly a wonderful, useful thing. But when it comes to things that are good happening to you, it's a problem, because it means that you have to find ways to back off from this treadmill and let things deliver pleasure again. Which is why the findings on gratitude are so persuasive. Things that I originally dismissed as sort of unconscionably cheesy, like keeping a gratitude journal. I mean, I can complain about how cheesy it is, but the fact is, the studies are there and it works, and I've done it and it does work. It's to actually try and bring back into conscious focus some of the things that you had become blasé about is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, so that's our first tip for the day, the gratitude journal. What about one of the sort of absolute planks of positive psychology is goal setting and being motivated in that kind of Anthony Robbins, you can do anything once you set your mind to it message, which suits type A personalities and people who have tendencies to overachieve anyway. Could you tell us a little bit about the sort of flip side of that and the things about goal setting that are, that imply rigidity of thinking?
It's a huge, absolutely, as you say, standard plank. There's this wonderful, famous study, the Yale study of goals, that says that in the graduating class of 1953 in Yale University, the people who had made, the 3% of people who had specific written down goals for the rest of their lives amassed more wealth than the other 97% combined in the 20 years after they graduated. But it turns out to be completely made up. And when you ask self-help gurus to tell you, where they got it from another self-help guru, and it goes around in circles. I got Yale to double check that this doesn't exist, and it really doesn't. I think there are lots of different problems with goal setting. There's some fascinating work now to suggest that companies which very strongly emphasize to their employees the importance of meeting certain targets, that those employees are more likely to cut ethical corners, for example. I think the sort of big macro level problem is that in any life or organization or whatever entity it is that's setting a goal, the only way you can do that is by singling out one or two factors and trying to maximize them. And what you don't realize is that everything else in that life or that company is going to, or that government, society, is going to be distorted as a result. There's a wonderful quote from John Muir, the American naturalist, about, I can't remember the exact words, but about when you tug on any one thread in the world, you find it connected to all the others. So stereotypical example is the person who says, I'm going to be a millionaire by the age of 40. That's my goal. And, he meets the goal, but at the cost of alienating his children won't talk to him and his health is ruined or whatever. That's the sort of prismatic example.
Tell us about that a little bit more in relation to climbing Everest.
Well, this was a fascinating story I came across. I mean, the story itself is very famous of what happened on Everest in 96. It's the subject matter of John Krakauer's excellent book, Into Thin Air. But that book doesn't really tell you why it happened, the fact that 8 climbers died in one 24-hour period. And other people have tried to find out why it happened and not really been able to explain it. What was so interesting about this work by this scholar called Christopher Case, who I write about in the book, is that he actually took insights from organizational sociology and the world of management consulting, which at first your sort of heart sinks and you think, management consultant's going to tell people how not to die on Everest. But it's actually a really, really amazing insight, I think, about how people's goals become such a fundamental part of their identity. It becomes such a fundamental part of who they are, that when they get negative information that suggests they should call off that goal, and in the case of the climbers in 96, it's too late in the day, they're bottlenecked, traffic jammed on the mountain, they have to turn back. They don't turn back and come to grief. Because actually the thing that takes priority is the desire not to feel uncertain and anxious and insecure. And the way to get rid of those feelings is to stamp them out by committing more strongly to the goal. I mean, it's not the right way, but it's what happens. And so in many different domains, he shows, you get this phenomenon where precisely because it's looking bad for the goal, people commit even more strongly to it, because otherwise they would have to just coexist with feelings of uncertainty and anxiety and nervousness.
So the irony on Everest is that they all met their goal and they all died.
Yes, I mean actually they didn't all die, but yeah, no, there was a huge death toll. But yeah, they'd reached the summit. I mean, yeah.
Let's move to another example. Since we're at a writers' festival, we should try and find a couple of literary examples. And one of them refers to Dostoevsky and the White Bears. So would you like to tell us a little bit about ironic process theory?
Sure, I'll try. Well, this is the only Dostoevsky connection is that it apparently began with him, or he at least used to torment his brother with it. This well-known sort of parlor game where you challenge somebody to not think about a polar bear for a minute or 2 minutes. We won't do it for that long, but if you just try now to not think about a polar bear for a few seconds, the effects can be quite
It's impossible in this
amusing.
heat. It's just impossible.
The simple point being that when you do that, the way the human mind works is, this is all the work of a Harvard psychologist called Daniel Wegner, that when you endeavor to control your thoughts in that direct way, first of all, you try and fill your mind with anything else. You think desperately about anything that isn't a polar bear. But secondly, you then have to have this sort of internal monitoring process that just sort of scans the mind all the time to see if there are any white bear thoughts popping up. And it can work in limited ways, but the point is that as soon as you're stressed or depressed or tired or trying too hard, the monitoring process takes over. The monitoring process takes center stage, and all you can think about is white bears. There's some very funny lab studies where they get people to speak their interior monologue while trying not to think about white bears, and it's completely impossible. And
it's sort of analogous with dieting, isn't it? It's what the brain does when you start to deprive yourself of food. Your brain goes, I've got to stockpile the fat because she stopped eating. It's the same thing.
Right. Well, and the problem with dieting is that you have to think about food all the time. Yeah. And this now sort of seems to apply in all sorts of fields beyond. And beyond that, just that one experiment. So, in mood control, if people in experiments who are told about an upsetting event, but then told not to feel sad about it, end up reporting that they feel worse on various measures than people who aren't told that. People who try not to feel grief after a bereavement take the longest to recover from grief, and more likely to get into sort of complex grief symptoms. There's one very entertaining study where they showed male college undergraduates, sort of pictures of scantily clad women and measure their, on their skin, measure their conductivity of their skin to measure sexual arousal, and the ones who are told to not think about sex and to think about their parents instead. I know, it's weird. Recorded higher levels of arousal. It's the effort to not do the thing that brings on the problem. And that's, I guess, the basic pattern that I try and explore, and particularly ask if there are any solutions to. I think it's the problem with positive thinking, certainly. But then,
one of my favourite quotes in the book is "Inspiration is for amateurs," and I was wondering whether, again, sticking with the sort of the literary context, you could talk a little bit about the lessons learnt from the habits of writers and artists in terms of productivity and how they deal with procrastination and...
Yeah, no, I will. And it's what's so fascinating about this for me is that although I do write about it in the book, it also was the only reason I actually got the book written, was incorporating these techniques into my own otherwise very procrastination-filled daily routines. If you ask a motivational guru how to deal with procrastination or how to make sure you get your great American novel written or whatever it is, they will advise getting motivated. They'll advise trying to cultivate the right mind state so that you really feel like doing it, sort of pumping yourself up using visualization, setting really ambitious, exciting goals, repeating affirmations to yourself, all of this stuff, all of which is an effort to cultivate the right set of emotions to act. What you see if you look both at actual, productive authors and artists and people like Chuck Close, that quote comes from, the artist, and at the sort of more reputable end of the psychology literature, is that this actually adds another hurdle to the process, because now you not only have to do some work, you have to feel like doing some work as well, and it's a much bigger requirement. And what the sort of Buddhist-inspired approach, for example, would say is, well, you should instead find a way to sort of be okay with the presence of those negative emotions, and by the way, at the same time, to act. And if you look at the rituals that that I think you're talking about, you find this over and over again. So you find, you don't find great novelists standing in front of the mirror, pumping their fists every morning and telling themselves they're going to write the best chapter that's ever been written. You find things like Graham Greene saying he's going to write 300 words a day for every day of his life. A very sort of it's a sort of process goal, but not an ambitious thing, not about trying to get into the right mind state, not about trying to sort of motivate. The Chuck Close quote is, the full quote is, "Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up and get to work." If you wait for inspiration, you'll be waiting forever. My favorite is Anthony Trollope, who wrote for 3 hours in the morning every day before he went to his job at the post office. And if he finished a novel within 1 3-hour period, he just went on to the next novel. Which is, probably a little bit hardcore, but the idea there is just, it's a question of going through motions and letting inspiration come, rather than waiting to get exactly the right mind state before you can do anything.
It's kind of summed up really in the sort of Nike slogan of "just do it," isn't it?
It is, although I think that slogan gets used in a very positive, thinky way. But I mean, the line that really helped me came from an author called Julie Fast. It was that you don't need to wait to feel like doing something in order to do it. And as I say, it is in the book, and the book is about that stuff, but also there would be no book unless I'd taken that on board while I was trying to crank it out.
Another of the most entertaining chapters in the book is the one in which you visit a very unusual museum. A unique museum, I guess. The Museum of Failure?
The Museum of Failed Products, yes, in Ann Arbor in Michigan. It's not the official name, and they actually don't like that name anymore. The founder kind of did like that name, but they've been taken over by another company that doesn't. It's a showcase, a very large sort of product library in an ex-car dealership in Michigan that consists of tens of thousands of failed supermarket products, food and house products, which, just some examples are Clairol's A Touch of Yogurt shampoo, pre-scrambled microwavable scrambled eggs in a tube with a stick, Like, I don't know if about Australia, but in the UK, sherbet used to be packaged in this way. And the idea is that you can sort of shovel scrambled egg into your mouth while driving to work. Didn't make it. Some breath mints that were fine other than the fact that they were packaged in tiny little packets that looked like street drugs. And the police caused a huge fuss in Chicago, I think, and they had to withdraw them from sale. The reason I use this thing, apart from that it's just lots of fun to go and spend some time looking at this stuff, they didn't intend to set up a museum of failed products. They just intended to collect one example of every new product that was launched. But of course, almost every product, or most products, fail. So in the end, you're going to accumulate a collection of failed products. And what's amazing about this is that the way they make their money now, it's not open to the public. The way they make their money is that product design executives from companies pay to come and inspect what has not worked before, including sometimes products that their own companies made and that they didn't keep proper records of, because the sort of argument I try and unspool in the book, because we're so unwilling to dwell on and spend time looking at failure. It just isn't a part of your average consumer marketing firm's protocol to spend a good few weeks looking at what hasn't worked in the sector. They just charge on to the next stuff, the sort of the next hoped for success, and then they realize that they've got to go to the Museum of Failed Products and see that in some cases it was actually them a few years ago that tried this attempt at sort of a product that didn't work.
It's interesting, because I would have thought that many people in the creative arts, in the creative industries, would say that failure, however painful, is always the laboratory for success.
I mean, it's a very widespread view. I sort of, in the book, get a little bit annoyed with that view too, because what you find is that a lot of very successful people say, well, the reason I'm so successful is because I was willing to tolerate failure. Richard Branson is a big one for this. His autobiographical business books are full of this idea. But of course, you only ever hear from the people who embraced failure and then went on to great success and then got asked to write celebrity autobiographies about why they're so great. You don't ever actually hear from people who were willing to fail and then just did fail. And so in a way, that focus on, well, you've got to fail to succeed is sort of an aversion to failure in itself, because the survivor bias is so prevalent. We're only looking at the successes. There's some great work by one or two people, like the historian Scott Sandage that I write about, actually looking truly at failure rather than just failure as a stepping stone to success. But yeah, I
guess I detect there, Oliver, a healthy dose of skepticism in you, and that leads me to ask you about something that I've noticed recently. I went to see. Recently, I've seen David Attenborough speak, and I've seen Tim Berners-Lee speak. And what characterized both of these men was that they seem, at the end of very rich, fulfilling, extraordinary careers, to still have the same sense of awe and wonder about the world in which they live. They seem to be absolutely devoid of cynicism.
Right.
And I wonder whether you think that absence of cynicism is partly part of the formula or recipe for, if not happiness, a kind of contentment.
That's interesting, because I mean, I try in the work I do in this area. It's really hard to stay on the skeptical side of the skeptical, cynical distinction. I mean, this is still a book about the challenge of becoming happy rather than a sort of tirade against the very idea. Or at least I hope that's what it is. I definitely think the awe and wonder are very fundamental there. The way that it specifically connects, I suppose, to what I've been thinking about is the idea that awe is actually an emotion that involves negative and positive components. It's the ability to be present in uncertainty and not to try to get everything sort of neatly tied up in a bow. And the psychologist called Paul Perils, who's done a lot of work on awe, points out that it's sort of fear and anticipation combined. I mean, there's a fear aspect to being sort of awed by a building or by the potential for a new technology or whatever it is. And I think that those people probably very neatly encapsulate that insight from Keats, about negative capability. They can rest in mystery. They don't need to try and sort it all out and close it all off. And probably that desire to close it all off and get it all clear is what causes people is what explains the other kind of person who has some enormous success, but then that's it, because they sort of, they've got to the stage where they're just satisfied with the answer, and they've made enough of their life circumstances are luxurious enough that they don't need to they're not hungry anymore, whatever. And I think probably the opposite of that is what you're identifying.
And these things that you're talking about now apply not just to the sort of well-being of individuals, but this also impacts on public policy. And I was wondering whether you might like to say a little bit about, since we've just talked about fear, and before we were talking about the sort of Stoics idea that you should anticipate the worst. Could you talk a little bit about how this applies to our notion of security in the era of terrorism?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I try in the section on the book about security to connect security as we think of it, as in, having your bag searched going through the airport, all the way through to sort of existential, the sense of insecurity that I think a lot of us feel a lot of the time. Drawing on the great sort of popularizing work of Alan Watts, the 60s, 70s counterculture philosopher, who I think very wisely said in his book, The Wisdom of Insecurity, that what makes us feel so insecure is the quest to get secure, that they are the same thing, that the feeling of insecurity and the desire for security are the same thing, and that actually we need somehow to open to the insecurity rather than constantly struggle to be perfectly secure. It seems like that would be something that you could say in the context of spirituality or personal happiness, but that it wouldn't really apply to, stopping planes getting blown up. But actually, I think if you look at that field, there's some really interesting insights. There's I think a lot of where we have gone wrong in air security in the last sort of since 9/11 comes from this kind of idea that there can be perfect security. And the leading thinker and writer in this field, Bruce Schneier, was asked very soon after 9/11 if there's anything that he could recommend that could make sure that absolutely certain that something like 9/11 would never happen again. And he says, sure, ground all the planes. If we don't have air travel, then we're not going to have horrifying air-related terrorist attacks. The point being that functioning in any way in life as a society, infrastructure, absolutely involves a trade-off between security and insecurity. There's no way that you can make it perfectly secure. If you, on a personal level, if you knew exactly what was going to happen to you from now until the end of your life, I think most of us anyway would not, if we thought about it, would probably not want that knowledge. There would be something very, very unwelcome about that. And so, we put all these things into, for example, air security, these things that help promote the feeling of security among air travelers alongside the feeling of annoyance, but don't actually make things any safer, because they are, it's a question of each new, if a terrorist uses a certain object, then you ban that object. Well, a terrorist's not going to use that object for the next time anyway. Bruce Schneier is very fond of going to public places and explaining how you could use perfectly legal carry-on items to hijack a plane, because the way he sees it, he's just proving his point that there isn't some secret knowledge, and you're ultimately never going to win every time against someone who is willing to die in the attempt.
Now, this week your blog article is a review of a book about The Secrets of Happy Families, a book by
Bruce Feiler.
Bruce Feiler. And I was just wondering whether you might like to tell us a little bit about his ideas and your response to those ideas.
Oh, all right. I mean, this is something I do very often in the column. It's just a short thing, and I sort of come across something that's been published that I think is great or makes me annoyed or something like that. And in this case, there was a headline over an excerpt from this book in the Wall Street Journal. The headline was, "Run your family like a business." And I thought, why would you want to do that? Actually, I shouldn't be mean to him. That's not really, he doesn't go that far in the book. The book is an argument that or at least part of the book is an argument that various work philosophies that have come from the software world primarily, including this approach called Agile, which anyone who works in software will be aware of, that is all about, being extremely responsive and flexible, trying to not just set a big goal and then tell everyone to go off and spend the next year putting into practice, but to try to integrate bottom-up feedback so that if someone runs into a problem on the first day, that gets integrated into where the whole organization is going the day after. Really interesting stuff. And I just make the point, I guess, that I don't think there's anything wrong with integrating these techniques from business into your family life. He suggests family meetings on the same basis as these agile daily scrums where you collect information about what's working and what's not working. I don't think there's anything necessarily terrible about that. I think the big worry is that you would accidentally turn your family into a business in the sense of its goals, because even the best business is still treating its people as a means to some kind of end, even if it's a great end. Whereas obviously in a family, I think the people are the end.
More ways than one.
Yes. So you wouldn't, you probably can't really fire underperforming members of your family. People do, I suppose. But and you wouldn't. I don't think most of us would say that the definition of a happy family was the one that achieved the most sort of headline-grabbing things, or that grew the most, with all these things that business does. So I was just trying to make that distinction between the good and bad sides of running your family like a business.
We've got about 15 minutes left, and I sense that there might be some questions from the audience at this point. I know it's horribly, horribly hot, but if you could bear to make your way to the microphone in the centre, and when you get there, stand relatively close to the microphone.
Hi, thank you for that. Adelaide's recently hosted Martin Seligman as a thinker in residence here,
Yep.
and his particular brand of positive psychology is being rolled out in schools around the state.
PERMA, is that, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, PERMA. I was wondering if you had any comments on his brand of positive psychology, which I think might be a bit different to just positive thinking. And yeah, I'd love to hear.
No, that's exactly the distinction I make. I think as I understand it, what defines positive psychology is just psychological research that looks at the causes of happiness instead of only focusing on the causes of pathologies and disorders and problems. I don't think it implies a specific method or approach, whereas positive thinking is this idea that you can use the will to control your own, or to heavily influence your own inner states and those of others. I think some positive psychologists are positive thinkers in a way that is that is not helpful and not supported by a lot of the research. I don't think he is. I think he's actually quite open about being quite grouchy himself as a person.
I think he's reacting to the self-esteem
Right.
movement that I grew up in, where
Right.
every line on the page is a work of art. And
Yeah.
I think he's trying to counter that.
I think, to the extent that all, I mean, first of all, he's a professional. I'm a, reporter, journalist person, and I think he's done some amazing stuff, and I think that basically the idea of resilience that comes out of that is completely in tune with what I would argue from the basis of the research that I did. I think there are aspects of positive psychology that I think do oversimplify the quest and make assumptions about how the willpower works that are just not true. But I don't associate him with them. No, I think he's a good thing.
And interestingly, thank you for that question, because I was going to ask you about Martin Seligman on a couple of counts, partly because of his notion, which apparently is verified in terms of other scientific research, that genetically at least, we are all born with a certain kind of happiness setting, and that some of his techniques that he espouses in learned optimism can help you to raise your happiness setting by about 10%,
right,
but not much more.
Right, it's there's the set point, I forget the exact ratio, but basically the set point and a small amount your circumstances, less than you'd think, your socioeconomic situation are contribute to happiness, and then there is the bit that you can change. Yeah.
And more recently as well, he's been working with the US Army on a sort of antidote, as it were, or a program to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is about creating what I think they're calling whole soldier fitness.
Right.
Are you aware of that particular program?
I am. I don't know much about it. I do know there's an extraordinarily huge and awful suicide problem in the US Army. And I do think that although, one always has, or I always have qualms about things that are being developed for sort of military purposes. One thing that is true is that the military does act as a kind of crucible for where you have to get these things right. It just reminds me of the motivational seminar, the huge, ridiculous event that I went to at the beginning for the early portion of this book, where they tell you to sort of eliminate the word impossible from your vocabulary and all this stuff. There were military people in the audience who I talked to afterwards who said, this is an absolutely useless philosophy if you're involved, if you're in the military. What they actually have to do all the time is plan out failed scenarios and figure out how things could go wrong. Obviously, there are very prominent recent cases where the top people in the Pentagon didn't do that, but I do think that the military can be the incentives there are such that it can be the focus for some really interesting work in these fields.
Another question from the audience, if anybody can bear to get up
I'm
and
just collapsing into a pool of sweat
melt
here.
their way to the microphone. Otherwise, would you like me to keep going? Well, in that case, let me just ask you a little bit about Barbara Ehrenreich and her book, Smile or Die, because she also, like you, was very skeptical about the whole happiness industry, writing from the personal point of view of someone who was battling cancer and who was really annoyed by the sort of notion that you were supposed to wage war against your cancer with positive thinking, and that if you didn't, then you were to blame for your cancer getting the better of you.
Yeah.
Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, it's a brilliant book. I mean, it's different from the approach I'm taking in the sense that it's a polemic about the various different ways in which positive thinking has caused problems. Maybe I flatter myself, but I thought in a way maybe I sort of then wanted to go to the next place that after she'd done such a great job of that, which is to say, well, what can we do instead, and what is an alternative? What are alternatives that aren't so heavily dependent on this damaging sort of cult of positivity? But her account of breast cancer culture, the world of pink ribbons, where you're not really allowed in certain contexts to say that actually you think what you're going through is pretty terrible, and you want to say that, and you're sort of told off for doing so, not by doctors so much, but by other people in support groups and things like that. And she makes the argument that actually it's not necessarily because there's a lot of proof that will increase, that will help your chances of your health, but that it just makes it easier for other people if they don't have to deal with your sort of difficult to deal with emotions. It's a lot nicer for sort of polite society if everyone's just grinning about everything. And she also talks very, very powerfully about the role of positive thinking in the global financial crisis.
She does.
Pointing out that a lot of the people who consume the kind of books and the ideology that we're talking about here, well, on one side of the coin, they were the investment bankers who convinced themselves that as long as they believed in their complex new financial instruments, that meant they would definitely succeed. And it was sort of a bad mark against you in the office to be the person at the meeting bringing up the fact that they might go catastrophically wrong. And then on the other side of the coin, people taking out mortgages, houses that they couldn't really afford because they'd been told that they believe that if you really, really dream that you can live in a house like this, then that dreaming with sufficient willpower is what will make it come true.
Yeah, catastrophic. Question.
Sorry. That leads directly to the question I had about Susan Cain and her book, I think it's called Quiet, The Power of Introverts. And I was wondering whether there's, if you could comment on the relationship between the sort of positive thinking and extroversion and the kind of selection of extroverts for companies and stuff. And Susan Cain made the same point about the financial crisis, that if that industry had contained more cautious thinkers who were prepared to go slow and quietly, that these things might not happen.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any sort of facts at my fingertips to back this up, but it just seems very, very intuitive that extroversion and optimism and introversion and pessimism, there might be a certain degree of overlap there. Certainly the whole culture of positive thinking is very extroverted. If you go to I guess I'm sort of in between that, in the middle of that scale really, but when you go to these motivational seminars and have to leap up out of your chair and clap and cheer every 5 minutes, it's definitely a setting for extroverts. In the same way as she talks about the importance of introverts in organizational contexts in that book, I think there's definitely a good argument that if you're in every team attacking some big project at work, it's good if you have a pessimist, because pessimists are the people, we think of them as the people who bring everyone else down, but actually they're the people who are using, hopefully, this idea of defensive pessimism. They're thinking ahead to what could go wrong. They are oftentimes, reducing the anxiety of themselves or the group by pointing out that actually it will be copable with if that happens. So I feel like there's an affinity there. I can't say more than that. But.
Next question.
I found your book a very interesting one. About 20 years ago, I was working in oncology, and we did a review of the literature because of a lot of the charlatans who were around at that time, who were very much trying to push people with cancer to, change their thinking and all the rest of it. And there was a lot of review of the literature and some studies done at the time, and they discovered that positive thinking made no difference in the outcome for cancers, except that there was a possibility that in breast cancer that some women lived longer with positive thinking, but they concluded that they died worst.
Right.
And that with more symptoms and more problems. And so I guess one of the things you haven't touched on is about, talking this afternoon, is what you talk about in the book about death denial and about confronting death. And in fact, often that's a much more helpful way, in fact, for people with terminal illness, I believe.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good point. I think... I don't think I'm not fully up to speed on all, but I don't think that the idea that your mental state has connections to your bodily healing is something to sort of throw out. I don't think that's something that there is sort of no evidence for. I think there is some really interesting evidence in support of that idea. But the problem is the problem is not optimism or feeling upbeat in the face of something terrible. The problem is the effort to try to change yourself from being a person who doesn't think that way into someone who does think that way, and what goes wrong in that process. So again, and this sort of generalizes to the whole of what I talk about, I think. It's not that if you leap out of bed very happy every morning naturally that's you should, fix that and find a way of being more gloomy, although sometimes a bit of pessimism might help you plan for the future and things like that. But it's just that what doesn't work, and I think you're right. I mean, it sounds like you've done a lot more research into the literature of that area than me. It's that attempt to think yourself into a different situation physically that is just turns into a battle that doesn't result in victory. Yeah.
Thank you. Last question.
I think you said a little bit earlier that there was a link between the sort of cult of positivity and the culture of individualism. Would you talk a bit more about that and how you see that's kind of come about and where we might go with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic, but I guess just sort of briefly, a huge proportion of these ideas in the self-help industry and self-improvement, obviously by definition, the word is in the title. They're about the improvement and enhancement of the self. And I think that is where this dynamic really, it's the same pattern that I've been talking about all the way through today. If you focus relentlessly on the self, it's not a great way to make yourself your self's experience of life the best kind, and that there's all this well-known evidence about how volunteering and other kinds of other focused activities actually are better for people's well-being, because I assume at least partly it involves less of a counterproductive direct focus on the self, in the same way that the direct focus on not thinking about polar bears and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it would follow from that societies either today or historically that have had less of a focus on the realization of the sort of best possible self may end up with happier people better able to accommodate the sort of times when the self doesn't feel so good. Then you go even further into Buddhism about, is the self an illusion? But let's not go there in this hour, maybe.
Sadly, we can't. We've come to the end of our time together. I hope you found it as stimulating and as inspiring as I have to have this reality check from Oliver. Please join me in thanking Oliver Burkeman.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate it.